Some people think a uniform tells them everything they need to know about a person. They usually discover the truth when it's already too late. The dining room of Whitmore House Restaurant shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, where the soft glow of golden light reflected across polished marble floors and hand-cut wine glasses. Every table was occupied by executives, attorneys, investors, and families who wore success as naturally as tailored suits and designer dresses. Conversations drifted through the air like quiet music, blending with the gentle notes of a piano near the fireplace. Claire Bennett moved silently between the tables, balancing a silver tray with practiced grace. At 24, she had mastered the art of becoming invisible whenever wealthy guests wanted someone to serve them without acknowledging the human being carrying their dinner. Her black apron was spotless. Her blonde hair was tied into a simple bun. Her blue eyes rarely lingered on anyone longer than necessary. She greeted every guest with the same calm smile, regardless of whether they returned it. Most never did. She preferred it that way. Across the restaurant, the front doors opened, and conversations softened almost instantly. Ethan Whitmore stepped inside with the quiet confidence of a man who never needed to announce himself. At 39, he had built one of the largest investment firms on the East Coast while raising his 8-year-old son alone after years of unimaginable personal loss. Beside him walked Noah, carrying a small sketchbook beneath one arm, his curious eyes absorbing every detail around him. On Ethan's other side was Victoria Whitmore, elegant in an ivory designer dress that seemed selected less for comfort than for making an entrance. Every smile she offered was perfectly measured. Every movement suggested someone accustomed to admiration. The hostess welcomed them warmly before escorting them toward the restaurant's most private dining section. Claire glanced up only long enough to recognize their reservation before walking over with 3 menus resting neatly against one arm. "Good evening. Welcome back, Mr. Whitmore," she said gently. "It's wonderful to have you with us again." Ethan nodded politely without looking away from his son, who had already become fascinated by the massive aquarium stretching across one wall. Victoria accepted her menu with barely concealed impatience, her eyes traveling slowly over Claire's simple uniform before settling on the small order notebook in her hand. "You'll be serving us tonight?" she asked. Claire answered with the same steady smile. "Yes, ma'am." Victoria tilted her head slightly, watching Claire prepare to write. "Interesting. I wasn't expecting handwritten notes." Claire simply waited. "Would you care for sparkling or still water this evening?" she asked calmly. Victoria didn't answer immediately. Instead, she exchanged a knowing glance with one of the guests seated at the neighboring table, who offered an amused smile in return. Then, with a voice just loud enough for nearby diners to hear, she laughed softly and said, "Well, I suppose that's easier than reading, isn't it? An illiterate waitress probably shouldn't be anywhere near important conversations." The laughter that followed was brief. Only a handful joined in. Claire lowered her eyes for just a heartbeat before looking back up, her expression unchanged. The restaurant became strangely still. She folded her notebook closed with quiet precision, met Victoria's gaze without the slightest hint of anger, and spoke in flawless Italian. "Signora, would you prefer that I repeat your observation in Italian for our guests from Milan? Or shall we continue in English so everyone understands exactly what was said?" The smile disappeared from Victoria's face. Every fork stopped moving. Every whispered conversation dissolved into silence. Even the pianist's hands hovered motionless above the keys. And for the first time that evening, Ethan Whitmore slowly lifted his eyes from the menu and truly looked at the shy waitress standing before his table. Claire neither smiled nor frowned after the silence settled over the dining room. She simply inclined her head with quiet professionalism, as though nothing unusual had happened, then gently asked once more, this time in English, "Would your table prefer sparkling water or still water this evening?" The question floated through the room with unexpected grace, giving everyone permission to breathe again. A few guests looked down at their plates. Others suddenly found their wine glasses fascinating. The tension that had filled the restaurant only moments earlier slowly dissolved into the soft clinking of silverware returning to life. Victoria blinked twice before forcing a tight smile. "Sparkling," she answered, her confidence noticeably thinner than before. Claire wrote nothing down. She simply nodded once. "Certainly, ma'am." She walked toward the service station with measured steps that never hurried and never hesitated. Behind the polished espresso machine, another waitress leaned closer, eyes wide with disbelief. "Claire," she whispered, "since when do you speak Italian?" Claire reached for 3 crystal water glasses without looking up, long enough to know that kindness sounds better in every language. Her co-worker opened her mouth to ask another question, but Claire had already returned to the Whitmore table carrying a silver tray balanced effortlessly on one hand. Ethan watched her movements with growing curiosity. They were precise without appearing rehearsed. Every glass landed exactly where it belonged. Every napkin remained perfectly aligned. There was an unusual confidence beneath her quiet demeanor, the kind that could never be taught during restaurant training. Noah continued studying Claire with innocent fascination. Children often notice details adults ignored. He watched how she greeted the elderly couple 2 tables away with genuine warmth, how she paused for an extra second to help an older gentleman adjust his chair without making him feel embarrassed, and how she thanked the kitchen staff each time they handed her another plate. She treated every person exactly the same. Wealth did not impress her. Status did not intimidate her. "Excuse me," Noah said softly as Claire finished placing fresh bread on the table. "Do you really know Italian?" Claire looked toward him with a warm smile that immediately softened the boy's nervous expression. "A little," she answered. Noah grinned. "Can you teach me one word?" Before Claire could respond, Victoria gently interrupted with a laugh that sounded pleasant but carried unmistakable impatience. "Noah, sweetheart, do not distract the staff. They have tables to serve." The boy lowered his eyes. "I was only asking." Claire noticed the disappointment immediately. She leaned down just enough to speak comfortably without interrupting the dining room around them. "There is one word worth learning," she said quietly. Noah's eyes brightened again. "Respect." She spoke the Italian word slowly, allowing him to repeat each syllable until he pronounced it perfectly. Noah smiled proudly. "What does it really mean?" Claire's expression remained gentle. "It means remembering that every person deserves kindness before they have earned your admiration." Ethan heard every word. Something about the answer lingered in his thoughts longer than he expected. It was not the language that impressed him. It was the conviction behind it. Across the table, Victoria lifted her wine glass without saying another word, but inside she felt something unfamiliar. For the first time in years, someone she considered insignificant had quietly taken control of a room without raising her voice, without insulting anyone, and without asking for attention. Claire excused herself with a polite nod before disappearing toward another table, unaware that nearly every guest she passed was now watching her differently than they had only minutes before. The dinner service continued, but the atmosphere around the Whitmore table had changed in ways that could not be measured by words alone. Claire moved naturally through the restaurant, refilling glasses, delivering carefully prepared dishes, and greeting every guest with the same composed courtesy she had shown since the beginning of her shift. She never glanced toward the Whitmore family unless they needed something, and that quiet discipline intrigued Ethan far more than any dramatic confrontation could have. Throughout his career, he had built a reputation for reading people within minutes. Investors revealed themselves through impatience. Executives exposed themselves through ego. Competitors often underestimated how much they communicated without speaking. Yet Claire Bennett remained an unreadable page. There was confidence without arrogance, intelligence without exhibition, and dignity without performance. It unsettled him because it was unfamiliar. Noah, meanwhile, had almost forgotten about the expensive aquarium across the room. His attention kept drifting back to the waitress who somehow made every guest feel seen without ever becoming the center of attention herself. He watched her kneel beside an elderly woman who had accidentally dropped her napkin. Before anyone else noticed, Claire had already replaced it with a clean one and quietly wished the woman a pleasant evening. She accepted a compliment from another table with nothing more than a grateful smile before disappearing toward the kitchen again. Noah leaned closer to his father. "Dad." Ethan looked up from reviewing a message on his phone. "Yes, buddy. She seems different." Ethan smiled faintly. "Different how?" Noah thought carefully before answering. "Everybody else keeps trying to show people how important they are. She does not." Ethan glanced toward Claire again. The observation lingered in his mind longer than he expected. Children rarely complicated their thoughts. They simply noticed what adults overlooked. Across the table, Victoria had remained unusually quiet ever since Claire's response in Italian. Although she maintained perfect posture and continued making pleasant conversation whenever neighboring guests greeted her, a quiet frustration simmered beneath her polished smile. She had intended to establish authority over a timid waitress. Instead, she had become the person everyone remembered for the wrong reason. That realization irritated her more than she cared to admit. She lifted her wine glass and spoke casually enough that only Ethan could hear. She enjoys making a scene. Ethan looked at her calmly. Did she? Victoria hesitated. Well, she embarrassed me. Ethan folded his napkin neatly beside his plate before answering. I believe she answered a question. Victoria looked away without replying. Before either of them spoke again, the restaurant manager hurried across the dining room toward their table, his face carrying the careful urgency of someone balancing hospitality with unexpected complications. Mr. Whitmore, he said politely, I apologize for interrupting your dinner. Your guests from Milan have arrived about 30 minutes earlier than expected. They are waiting in the private lounge. Ethan checked the time on his watch. Already? Yes, sir. They brought revised documents for tomorrow morning's acquisition meeting. Apparently, the legal team made several changes during their flight. Ethan stood slowly, smoothing the front of his navy jacket. Please tell them I will be there in just a few minutes. The manager nodded gratefully before hurrying away. Victoria offered a reassuring smile. Business never sleeps. Ethan returned a polite smile, but something about the manager's expression suggested there was more to the situation than a simple schedule change. As Claire emerged from the kitchen carrying another silver tray, she noticed the unusual activity near the private lounge. She did not pause or ask questions. She simply continued serving the surrounding tables with the same quiet professionalism. Yet without realizing it, she was walking toward the very conversation that would soon change every person in that room. Claire balanced a polished silver tray against one hand as she crossed the dining room, carefully weaving between tables where quiet conversations had returned to their comfortable rhythm. The scent of freshly baked rosemary bread drifted through the air while crystal glasses reflected warm light across the ceiling. From a distance, the evening looked flawless. Only those paying close attention could sense the subtle current of tension gathering near the private lounge. Through the partially open doors, four sharply dressed executives from Milan stood beside a long walnut conference table. Leather portfolios lay open before them, their pages marked with colorful tabs and handwritten notes. Their expressions were courteous, but there was unmistakable urgency in every gesture. Ethan entered the lounge with his usual composed confidence, extending his hand to greet each guest personally. The introductions were warm, yet efficient. Time mattered tonight. Tomorrow morning's acquisition would determine the future of two international companies, and everyone understood the weight resting inside those documents. Victoria remained near the entrance, observing the meeting with practiced elegance. She enjoyed being present whenever important people gathered. Influence, after all, was easier to display before successful witnesses. Noah quietly wandered toward a nearby bookshelf where several art books rested beside framed photographs of famous chefs who had visited the restaurant over the years. He flipped through the pages while humming softly to himself, perfectly content to stay out of the adults' business. Claire approached the lounge carrying a tray of coffee, sparkling water, and porcelain cups prepared exactly as the manager had requested. She knocked gently before stepping inside. Your refreshments, she said with her familiar calm voice. The executives thanked her politely. Ethan offered a brief nod without interrupting the discussion already unfolding around the conference table. Claire placed each cup carefully before every guest, noticing nothing more than a collection of contracts spread across the polished wood. She never allowed herself to read documents that were not hers. Professional boundaries mattered. As she turned to leave, one of the Italian executives sighed quietly and rubbed his forehead. The revised translation is still incomplete, he said in accented English. Our legal office corrected several sections during the flight, but the certified English version has not arrived. Another executive checked his phone with visible frustration. The translator's connecting flight was canceled because of the storm in Chicago. He will not arrive until tomorrow afternoon. Ethan remained calm, although his eyes narrowed slightly. Tomorrow afternoon is too late. The room fell into thoughtful silence. Victoria folded her arms confidently. Surely someone can summarize the changes. The oldest executive shook his head politely. Unfortunately, every word matters. One sentence interpreted incorrectly could alter financial responsibility by millions of dollars. Ethan looked toward the manager. Can we bring in another certified translator? The manager hesitated. At this hour, on short notice, I do not believe anyone is available. Victoria sighed dramatically before glancing toward the doorway where Claire had almost disappeared into the dining room. A faint smile slowly returned to her face, the kind that often appeared whenever she sensed an opportunity to regain control of a conversation. Well, she said with quiet sarcasm, perhaps your remarkably talented waitress speaks legal Italian as well. Apparently, she has many hidden gifts. A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the table, though no one laughed. Ethan did not respond immediately. His attention lingered on the unopened documents resting beside the untouched coffee cups. Outside the lounge, Claire continued serving another table, completely unaware that her name had just entered a conversation capable of changing the course of the entire evening. Claire had just finished helping an elderly couple celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary with a complimentary slice of cheesecake when the restaurant manager approached her with unusual urgency. He rarely interrupted her unless something truly required her attention. His normally relaxed smile had been replaced by careful concern. Claire, he said quietly, Mr. Whitmore would appreciate it if you could bring another pot of coffee to the private lounge. She nodded immediately. Of course. There was nothing unusual about the request itself, but as she prepared the fresh coffee, she noticed several members of the kitchen staff exchanging curious glances toward the closed conference room. Word traveled quickly in restaurants, especially when important guests arrived unexpectedly. Without asking questions, Claire arranged fresh cups, cream, sugar, and linen napkins on a polished silver tray before walking calmly toward the lounge once again. Inside, the atmosphere had grown noticeably heavier. Documents covered nearly every inch of the conference table. Several pages displayed handwritten corrections in blue ink beside paragraphs printed entirely in Italian. One executive quietly rubbed his temples while another compared two nearly identical versions of the same contract. Ethan remained composed, although his steady expression now carried the unmistakable focus of a man solving problems against an unforgiving deadline. Claire entered softly and began replacing empty coffee cups without interrupting the discussion. As she poured fresh coffee for the oldest executive, a loose page slipped from one of the open folders and drifted gently toward the floor. Before anyone else reacted, Claire bent down, picked up the page with both hands, and carefully returned it without allowing her eyes to linger on its contents. Thank you, the executive said warmly. You are very kind. Claire smiled politely. You are welcome, sir. Victoria watched the simple exchange with growing irritation. Every polite word directed toward Claire somehow felt like attention stolen from herself. She folded her arms and looked toward the scattered paperwork before speaking with an amused tone that barely concealed its sharp edge. Perhaps someone should ask whether she recognizes any of those legal terms. Apparently, she surprises everyone. Her comment produced several awkward smiles, but no one answered. Claire continued arranging the cups as though she had not heard a single word. The silence itself seemed to frustrate Victoria even more. Tell me, Claire, she continued, do you always work in restaurants? Or is international law your evening hobby? Claire looked at her calmly. I simply try to do my job well, ma'am. That was not my question. Claire lowered the coffee pot onto the tray before answering. No, it was not. Ethan finally looked up from the contract. His voice remained courteous but firm. Victoria, I think we have more important things to focus on. She forced another pleasant smile. I was only making conversation. Before anyone could respond further, one of the Italian executives suddenly frowned at the newest revision in front of him. He quietly spoke several sentences in rapid Italian to his colleagues. Their expressions changed almost instantly. One reached for a calculator, while another compared two different copies of the agreement. Ethan noticed the shift. Immediately. What happened? He asked. The executive sighed. There appears to be a discrepancy in one translated clause. If this wording is incorrect, the liability could transfer to your company instead of remaining with the seller. The room became still again. Every person around the table understood that one sentence could determine the outcome of an agreement worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Claire remained beside the door holding the empty coffee tray, prepared to leave as quietly as she had entered. Then, almost without thinking, her eyes briefly rested on the page that lay nearest the edge of the table. A nearly invisible crease formed between her eyebrows before disappearing just as quickly. She said nothing. She simply stood there for one thoughtful heartbeat, as though recognizing something that no one else in the room had yet noticed. Claire remained standing beside the doorway, her empty silver tray resting lightly against her side. She had spent years teaching herself that silence was often the safest response. Guests argued. Executives negotiated. Managers handled problems. Waitresses served dinner. That invisible line had protected her for a long time. She had no intention of crossing it now. The Italian executives continued exchanging increasingly concerned remarks while comparing the revised pages spread across the walnut table. One tapped a paragraph with his pen before shaking his head. Another reached for his reading glasses and carefully examined the wording again. Ethan watched each reaction without speaking. His instincts told him something was wrong, but instincts alone could not rewrite a contract. Victoria glanced toward Claire once more and noticed the almost imperceptible hesitation in her expression. "What is it?" she asked with unmistakable sarcasm. "Do not tell me you suddenly have an opinion about international acquisitions." Claire met her eyes for only a second before answering quietly. "No, ma'am." Victoria smiled with satisfaction. "That is what I thought." Claire inclined her head politely and turned toward the door. Before she reached it, the oldest Italian executive sighed deeply and said in his native language, "If only our translator had made it here tonight, this would already be resolved." The sentence stopped Claire where she stood. She closed her eyes for the briefest moment, almost as though weighing two difficult choices against one another. Finally, she turned back. "Excuse me," she said gently. Every conversation stopped. Claire's voice remained calm. "I apologize for interrupting. I may be mistaken, and if I am, please disregard what I am about to say." Ethan looked at her with genuine curiosity. "Go ahead." Claire hesitated. The concern does not appear to be the liability clause itself. One executive frowned. "What do you mean?" Claire kept a respectful distance from the table. "I only noticed a single sentence while returning the page that fell earlier. The Italian wording describes an obligation that becomes effective immediately upon execution of the agreement. The English revision appears to describe an obligation beginning after regulatory approval. Those are two different timelines." The room became completely still. The executives immediately looked down at the same paragraph. One of them silently reread the original Italian before comparing it with the English translation. Another slowly removed his glasses, then placed them back on as if hoping the words would somehow change. Ethan watched their faces instead of the paper. Their expressions told him more than the document itself. Victoria let out a short laugh that sounded more defensive than amused. She glanced at one page for 2 seconds. "Surely this is coincidence." Claire answered without the slightest trace of irritation. "It may be. I sincerely hope it is." The oldest executive suddenly stood from his chair and began reading the Italian passage aloud. His colleague followed each sentence on the English copy. They reached the disputed paragraph together. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, the younger executive looked directly at Ethan. "She is correct." Another executive nodded slowly. "Not approximately correct. Completely correct." The managers standing near the wall looked from Claire to the documents with open disbelief. Noah quietly lowered his sketchbook onto the table and stared at Claire with wide eyes, as though watching someone perform an impossible magic trick without ever trying to impress anyone. Ethan remained silent, but something inside him shifted. For the first time that evening, he was no longer wondering why a waitress spoke Italian. He had begun asking himself a far more important question. Who exactly was Claire Bennett before she ever put on that black apron? No one spoke for several long seconds after the confirmation. The silence carried a different weight now. It was no longer the uncomfortable quiet that follows embarrassment. It was the kind of silence that appears when certainty suddenly disappears. The oldest executive slowly closed the folder before looking directly at Claire. "Miss Bennett," he said with genuine respect, "how did you recognize the error so quickly?" Claire held the empty tray with both hands, almost as though it reminded her where she belonged. I noticed one verb, she answered softly. The translation changed an immediate legal obligation into a conditional one. It is a small difference, but in contracts, small differences are rarely small. The executive exchanged another glance with his colleagues. One of them smiled in disbelief. That explanation is exactly how our senior legal advisor described the problem before we left Milan. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Perhaps she simply has a good memory. Claire did not answer. She had never learned to defend herself by arguing. Ethan watched her carefully. Most people became eager to explain themselves after receiving unexpected praise. Claire did the opposite. She seemed almost uncomfortable being noticed. Would you mind taking one more look? Ethan asked politely. Only if you are willing. Claire hesitated. I am not a member of your team. Tonight, Ethan replied calmly. I am asking for your opinion, not your resume. The room waited. Claire slowly placed the silver tray on a nearby sideboard before approaching the conference table. She never reached for the documents until the oldest executive personally turned them toward her with a courteous nod. Even then, she rested her fingertips lightly on the edge of the paper as though asking silent permission before reading. Her eyes moved steadily across the Italian text. There was no dramatic pause, no performance, no attempt to impress anyone. She simply read. Every few moments, she quietly compared one paragraph to its English counterpart. Noah watched with complete fascination. To him, she looked less like a waitress and more like someone solving a puzzle that everyone else had abandoned. After nearly a minute, Claire gently pointed to 3 separate paragraphs. These sections all reference one another, she explained. The revised English version translates each sentence accurately by itself, but together they create an inconsistency. This paragraph says the seller remains responsible for regulatory costs. This one transfers administrative responsibility to the buyer. Then the final section accidentally combines both obligations. Legally, that could create unnecessary ambiguity. One executive immediately highlighted the passages. Another checked the original Italian copy again before slowly exhaling. She found a second issue. A third executive looked at Ethan with an astonished smile. Actually, she found 3. The manager standing quietly beside the wall could hardly believe what he was hearing. The restaurant staff knew Claire as the dependable waitress who never complained, volunteered to cover extra shifts, and always stayed late to help clean the dining room. None of them had imagined she could discuss international contract language with experienced corporate attorneys. Victoria finally leaned forward. Claire, she said, forcing another composed smile, you have certainly managed to surprise everyone tonight. Claire looked up with the same calm expression she had worn all evening. That was never my intention, ma'am. The answer carried no sarcasm, no hidden insult, only quiet honesty. Somehow, that made the words even more powerful. Ethan folded his hands together and continued watching her, realizing that every assumption he had formed during the first hour of dinner had quietly fallen apart. The woman standing beside his conference table had never asked anyone to underestimate her. They had simply chosen to do it on their own. Claire continued reading in complete silence while the executives watched every movement of her eyes. The room had become so quiet that the faint ticking of an antique clock mounted above the fireplace seemed unusually loud. Outside the private lounge, dinner service carried on as though nothing extraordinary were happening, but inside, an entirely different evening had begun. Claire carefully turned another page before gently sliding 2 versions of the contract side by side. She traced one paragraph with her finger without ever touching the printed words themselves. This section references Article 12, she said quietly. However, Article 12 was renumbered during the revision. The cross-reference should now point to Article 14. If it remains unchanged, the enforcement procedure could become legally unclear. One of the attorneys immediately searched the revised draft before looking up with widened eyes. She is right again. Another executive quietly shook his head in disbelief. That mistake survived 3 legal reviews. Ethan leaned forward, no longer hiding his curiosity. Please continue. Claire hesitated. Only if everyone is comfortable with that. The oldest executive smiled warmly. Miss Bennett, at this point, I believe we would all appreciate your observations. She nodded respectfully and continued. There was nothing theatrical about the way she worked. She never rushed to prove herself. She never paused dramatically before speaking. Every sentence was measured, careful, and supported by the text in front of her. This paragraph contains another subtle issue, she explained. The Italian version describes reasonable commercial efforts. The English version says best commercial efforts. Those expressions may sound similar in ordinary conversation, but they create different legal standards in contract law. One executive quietly whispered something in Italian that made the others exchange astonished glances. Even Victoria recognized enough from their expressions to understand they were no longer questioning Claire's knowledge. They were relying on it. Noah sat perfectly still, his sketchbook forgotten. Beside him, he had never seen adults listen so carefully to someone who spoke so softly. Ethan noticed his son's expression and smiled almost imperceptibly. The boy was witnessing something far more valuable than a business meeting. He was watching respect replace prejudice one quiet sentence at a time. Claire finished reviewing the remaining pages before carefully closing the folder and sliding it back toward the executives. "Those were the only inconsistencies I noticed," she said. "There may be others that require a specialist in international mergers. I would not want to overstate my confidence." The oldest executive looked at the corrected notes spread across the table and slowly laughed, not with mockery, but with genuine amazement. "Miss Bennett," he said, "you have already done the work of the specialist we were waiting for." Another executive extended his hand across the table. "On behalf of our company, thank you." Claire looked momentarily surprised before accepting the handshake with quiet humility. "You are very kind, sir." "No," he replied sincerely. "You have been kind to us." Victoria lowered her eyes to her untouched wine glass. Every confident remark she had made earlier in the evening echoed uncomfortably in her own mind. The woman she had dismissed as uneducated had just protected an agreement worth hundreds of millions of dollars without raising her voice or asking for recognition. Ethan stood from his chair and looked directly at Claire. There was no trace of the distant businessman who had entered the restaurant an hour earlier. Instead, there was genuine respect. "Miss Bennett," he said calmly, "when this meeting is finished, if you have a few minutes after your shift, I would like to ask you a question that has nothing to do with this contract." Claire met his eyes politely before offering the same composed smile that had never left her face all evening. "If time allows, Mr. Whitmore, I will be happy to listen. For now, your guests still deserve a good dinner, and the other tables are waiting." With that, she picked up her silver tray once again, quietly excused herself, and walked back into the dining room, leaving behind a room full of executives who had just learned that true expertise rarely announces itself before it changes everything. The dining room welcomed Claire back as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Orders continued arriving from the kitchen. Glasses needed refilling. Desserts waited beneath polished silver covers. She returned to her routine with the same quiet focus that had defined every shift she had ever worked. To the guests who had not witnessed the private meeting, she was simply another waitress moving gracefully between tables. To those who had, she had quietly become someone impossible to overlook. Near the window, Noah watched her carry a tray of entrees with effortless balance before turning toward his father. "Dad," he whispered, "why does she keep acting like nothing happened?" Ethan followed his son's gaze. Claire had just stopped beside an elderly veteran celebrating his birthday, patiently helping him read the evening dessert menu before wishing him a wonderful celebration. There was no trace of pride in her expression, no expectation that anyone should thank her again. Ethan answered softly, "Because she did not help for recognition. She helped because the work needed to be done." Noah nodded thoughtfully. "I like people like that." Ethan smiled. "So do I." Across the room, Victoria quietly observed the reactions unfolding around her. The restaurant manager personally thanked Claire as she passed the service station. One of the Italian executives briefly stepped into the dining room, simply to shake her hand once more before returning to the meeting. Even several guests who had overheard pieces of the conversation now greeted her with noticeably warmer smiles. None of them treated her as though she had become someone new. They simply realized they had never truly seen her before. Victoria gently placed her wine glass onto the table. The sound seemed unusually loud to her own ears. She replayed every word she had spoken earlier that evening. Each careless remark now felt heavier than before. For perhaps the first time in many years, she wondered how often she had mistaken appearance for ability without ever questioning herself. Inside the private lounge, the revised agreement moved forward quickly. The executives corrected the translation, verified every amendment, and confirmed the updated language together. What had seemed like an impossible delay less than an hour earlier had quietly become a productive collaboration. Before leaving, the oldest Italian executive approached Ethan with an appreciative smile. "Your restaurant employs remarkable people." Ethan looked through the open doorway toward Claire, who was helping a young family choose desserts. "The remarkable part," he replied thoughtfully, "is that I almost walked past her without ever noticing." The executive nodded knowingly. The world does that more often than it should. As the meeting concluded, Ethan remained standing beside the conference table long after everyone else had gathered their folders. He picked up the annotated contract, pausing where Claire had marked the corrected clauses. There were no dramatic notes written in the margins. Only 3 discrete pencil marks beside the paragraphs that required attention. Nothing more. It reflected the woman herself. Precise, humble, quiet. Before heading back into the dining room, Ethan asked the manager one simple question. "How long has Claire worked here?" "Almost 3 years," the manager answered proudly. "She has never been late, never complained. She covers extra shifts whenever someone is sick. Honestly, she is the kind of employee every restaurant hopes to find." Ethan looked surprised. "And no one mentioned her background?" The manager smiled gently. "Mr. Whitmore, Claire never talks about herself. If you ask her where she learned something, she usually changes the subject and asks whether someone needs more coffee." Ethan slowly folded the contract closed. The answer somehow revealed more about Claire than any impressive resume ever could. Outside the lounge, Claire paused for just a moment beside the large dining room windows. Rain had begun falling softly against the glass, blurring the city lights into warm streaks of gold. She watched the quiet reflection for a single peaceful breath before returning to another waiting table, completely unaware that the most important conversation of her evening had not yet begun. The dinner rush slowly began to fade as the last reservations settled into quiet conversations beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. Outside, the gentle rain continued washing across the restaurant windows, turning the city lights into soft ribbons of gold and silver. Claire quietly polished a row of crystal glasses behind the service station while the kitchen prepared its final dessert orders. To everyone watching, she appeared exactly as she had at the beginning of the evening. Calm, focused, unremarkable. Only the people inside the private lounge knew that the night would have unfolded very differently without her. Ethan remained seated alone after his guests departed, the corrected contract resting neatly inside his leather portfolio. He had postponed leaving because one question continued following him through every conversation. It had nothing to do with mergers or legal terminology anymore. It was about the woman who had solved problems she was never expected to understand. When the restaurant manager confirmed that Claire had finished serving her last table, Ethan quietly walked toward the service station. He stopped several feet away, careful not to interrupt while she finished arranging the polished glasses. "Miss Bennett." Claire turned with the same composed smile. "Good evening again, Mr. Whitmore. Would you have a few minutes now?" She glanced toward the manager, who nodded encouragingly. "Of course." Ethan gestured toward a quiet corner near the fireplace where the last guests had already departed. Noah happily followed with his sketchbook tucked beneath one arm, while Victoria remained at the table, watching from a distance without saying a word. Once they were seated, Ethan spoke with complete sincerity. "I owe you an apology." Claire looked genuinely surprised. "For what?" "For making assumptions before introducing myself properly." Claire answered gently. "Everyone makes assumptions sometimes." Ethan slowly shook his head. Not all assumptions carry the same consequences. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The fireplace crackled softly beside them while rain tapped against the tall windows overlooking the street. Finally, Ethan asked the question that had occupied his thoughts ever since the meeting ended. "Where did you learn everything you demonstrated tonight?" Claire looked down at her folded hands. There was no hesitation born from embarrassment, only quiet reflection. "Many years ago," she began softly, "I studied international law and comparative languages. I believed I would spend my life helping people understand one another across borders instead of arguing across conference tables." Ethan listened without interrupting. "After graduate school, I accepted a position with an international legal consulting firm in Boston. I loved the work. Every contract represented more than business. It represented trust between people who spoke different languages. Noah leaned forward with quiet curiosity. Then why did you stop? Claire smiled warmly at the boy before answering. Because sometimes life asks us different questions than the ones we prepared for. She looked toward the rain outside. My mother became seriously ill. She raised me by herself, and there was no one else to care for her. I resigned from my position and moved back home. For nearly 4 years, taking care of her became my full-time job. Ethan remained completely still. Claire continued without sadness or self-pity. When she passed away, I planned to return to legal work. But too much time had gone by. The opportunities disappeared, and the bills did not. This restaurant offered me honest work, supportive colleagues, and enough stability to begin rebuilding my life. She smiled faintly. I discovered that dignity is not determined by a job title. It is determined by how faithfully you perform whatever work is placed before you. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, realizing that the woman sitting across from him had never fallen from success. She had simply chosen love over prestige, and when life changed again, she had carried that same quiet excellence into a different uniform without ever asking the world to admire her for it. Claire's words lingered in the quiet corner of the restaurant long after she finished speaking. No one reached for another question. The crackling fireplace seemed louder now, not because the room had grown noisier, but because every person sitting there had become lost in a different thought. Ethan looked at the woman across from him with a kind of respect that could not be purchased, negotiated, or inherited. During years of board meetings, billion-dollar acquisitions, and endless interviews with accomplished professionals, he had rarely encountered someone who spoke about sacrifice without asking for sympathy. Claire had simply described the path she had chosen, then returned to polishing glasses as though there were nothing extraordinary about it. Noah quietly closed his sketchbook and looked from his father to Claire. His young face carried the straightforward honesty that adults often misplaced somewhere between ambition and pride. "Miss Bennett," he asked softly. Claire smiled at him. "Yes, Noah?" The boy hesitated for only a second. "When she said those things to you earlier?" He glanced toward Victoria before lowering his voice. "Did your feelings get hurt?" Claire considered the question carefully. "Words can hurt," she admitted gently, "but only if we allow them to decide who we are." Noah nodded slowly. "I think I understand." He looked toward his father again before speaking with surprising confidence. "Grandpa always told me that kind people never have to tell everyone they are important." Ethan smiled faintly. "He did," Noah continued, his innocent voice filling the quiet restaurant. "Tonight I saw something else too." Claire waited patiently. "You never tried to embarrass anybody, even after they embarrassed you." The simple sentence settled over the table like gentle rain. Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment. Victoria remained completely still several feet away, unable to pretend she had not heard every word. Noah was not accusing anyone. He was simply describing what he had witnessed with the uncomplicated honesty only a child could offer. Claire looked at Noah warmly. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man." Noah smiled. "He said respect is something you give before you know whether someone deserves admiration." Claire's expression softened. "Then he taught you something very valuable." Ethan quietly exhaled. He suddenly remembered countless business presentations where executives spoke passionately about leadership, integrity, and culture. Yet none of those expensive seminars had expressed the lesson as clearly as an 8-year-old boy had in one quiet sentence. He turned toward Claire. "You could have corrected Victoria in front of everyone much more harshly." Claire gently shook her head. "What would that have accomplished?" Ethan did not answer immediately. Claire continued, her voice as calm as ever. "Humiliating another person does not erase our own humiliation. It only creates another wound." She folded her hands together. "Sometimes the greatest victory is allowing people enough silence to hear themselves." Across the dining room, Victoria slowly stood from her chair and walked toward them. There was no dramatic expression on her face now. No polished confidence. No carefully practiced smile. She stopped beside the table, looking directly at Claire for several long seconds before finally speaking. "Miss Bennett." Her voice sounded noticeably quieter than it had all evening. "I owe you an apology." Claire immediately rose to her feet, not because Victoria demanded respect, but because Claire offered it naturally to everyone. Victoria lowered her eyes. "I judged you before I knew anything about you. I spoke carelessly, and I was wrong." Claire answered with the same grace she had carried from the beginning of the evening. Thank you for saying that. Victoria looked genuinely puzzled. That is all. Claire smiled gently. A sincere apology does not need to become a longer conversation. Sometimes accepting it is enough. For the first time that night, Victoria felt something she had not expected to find inside an elegant restaurant filled with successful people. Relief. Not because someone had forgotten her mistake, but because someone had chosen not to define her by it. Victoria remained standing for another moment before quietly returning to the table where her coat rested across the back of the chair. She looked different now, not because her elegant appearance had changed, but because the certainty she had carried into the restaurant had quietly dissolved. Ethan watched her leave without judgment. He understood better than most people that genuine change rarely arrived through arguments. It usually arrived through uncomfortable moments that forced someone to look inward. Claire picked up the empty coffee cups from the nearby table, preparing to finish the final tasks of her shift. To her, the evening was almost over. There were still linens to fold, silverware to polish, and tomorrow's reservation books to organize before she could head home. She had never expected this night to become memorable. Ethan stood and walked beside her as she carried the tray toward the service station. Miss Bennett, he said. Claire stopped politely. Yes, Mr. Whitmore. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a simple business card before placing it gently on the counter rather than handing it directly to her. I would like to offer you a position. Claire looked down at the card without touching it. Doing what? Leading our international compliance and cross-border legal strategy. Frankly, after tonight, I cannot imagine allowing someone with your abilities to remain unnoticed. Claire smiled softly, but there was no excitement in her expression, only gratitude. That is a generous offer. Ethan nodded. It is also a serious one. He paused before continuing. You would have every resource you need, a remarkable team, and the opportunity to work on projects that genuinely affect people's lives. Claire remained quiet for several seconds before speaking. May I answer honestly? Ethan smiled. That is the only answer I would want. She gently slid the business card back toward him. Then my answer is not today. Ethan looked surprised, but not offended. May I ask why? Claire rested both hands lightly against the polished counter. 3 years ago, I believed my career defined my purpose. Losing that career forced me to discover something much more important. She glanced around the peaceful restaurant where the kitchen staff laughed quietly while stacking clean dishes, where the manager thanked every employee before locking the reservation book, and where an elderly dishwasher waved goodnight to everyone by name. This place gave me dignity when I needed stability. These people never asked what my resume looked like before offering me respect. I cannot simply disappear because a better opportunity arrived. Ethan listened carefully. You feel responsible for them. Claire nodded. Loyalty should not expire the moment something more attractive appears. Ethan smiled with genuine admiration. Then perhaps I approached this the wrong way. He placed the business card back onto the counter. Keep it anyway. Not as an offer that expires, but as an open door. If one day your path changes again, I hope you will remember that there is a place for you. Claire looked at the card for a long moment before placing it carefully into the pocket of her apron. Thank you. Noah walked over carrying his sketchbook. Miss Bennett, can I show you something before we leave? Claire smiled warmly. Of course. He opened the final page. Instead of drawing the restaurant or the aquarium, he had carefully sketched a woman wearing a simple waitress uniform standing beneath a chandelier. Around her, everyone else was looking toward her, but she was looking toward an elderly customer with a gentle smile. Above the drawing, written in careful handwriting, were 5 simple words. The strongest people stay kind. Claire felt her eyes soften. That is beautiful, Noah. The boy grinned. I drew what I learned tonight. Ethan looked at the sketch, then at Claire, realizing that no business contract completed that evening would ever equal the quiet lesson his son would carry home for the rest of his life. Closing time arrived quietly. One by one, the last guests thanked the staff and stepped out into the cool evening, where the steady rain had finally softened into a gentle mist. The crystal chandeliers reflected against the wet sidewalk outside, turning every passing headlight into ribbons of warm light across the pavement. Inside the restaurant, chairs were carefully placed upside down on empty tables, while soft jazz drifted through the nearly silent dining room. Claire untied her black apron, folded it neatly, and placed it inside her locker. Exactly as she had done at the end of every shift for the past 3 years. Nothing about her routine suggested that this evening had changed anything. She still thanked the dishwasher before leaving. She still wished the cooks a safe drive home. She still helped the newest waitress wipe down the dessert station before picking up her light gray coat. As she stepped outside beneath the restaurant awning, she paused for a moment to listen to the quiet rain. Behind her, the front door opened again. Ethan and Noah walked out together while Victoria followed a few steps behind. There was no crowd waiting, no reporters, no dramatic applause, just 3 people who had entered the restaurant believing one story and were leaving with another. Noah ran toward Claire with his sketchbook tucked safely under his arm. "Miss Bennett," he called happily. Claire turned with the same warm smile she had shown him all evening. "Good night, Noah." The boy reached into his pocket and carefully handed her a folded piece of paper. "I forgot to give you this." Claire unfolded it slowly. Inside was the small drawing he had made, but beneath the picture he had added one more sentence in careful handwriting. "Thank you for teaching me to see people before I judge them." Claire looked at him, genuinely touched. "I will keep this," she said softly. "I promise." Noah smiled with the quiet satisfaction that only comes from giving something that cannot be bought. Ethan stepped forward. "Miss Bennett." Claire looked at him. "I suspect this will not be the last time our paths cross." She smiled gently. "Life has a way of surprising us." Ethan nodded. "If it does, I hope I recognize the opportunity faster next time." Claire laughed quietly. "That would make both of us more efficient." Even Victoria smiled at the exchange. She walked closer, extending her hand naturally this time, without pride and without hesitation. Claire accepted it. Nothing more needed to be said. Some conversations ended with speeches. Others ended with understanding. A black sedan slowly pulled to the curb. Noah climbed inside before lowering the window one last time. "Dad," he said as Claire waved goodbye, "I think tonight we met the smartest person in the restaurant." Ethan watched Claire begin walking down the rain-covered sidewalk beneath the glow of the streetlights. She did not look back. She did not wait for admiration. She simply disappeared into the ordinary rhythm of the city, carrying her folded umbrella in one hand and Noah's drawing safely inside her coat pocket. Ethan smiled quietly before answering his son. "No, buddy." Noah looked confused. Ethan kept watching the empty sidewalk where Claire had vanished into the evening. "Tonight we met someone far more rare than that. We met a person who never needed everyone else to know how extraordinary she was." The car pulled away, its headlights fading into the rain, while the restaurant lights slowly dimmed behind them. Somewhere farther down the block, Claire continued walking toward home with the same calm steps she had taken before anyone knew her story, because the strongest people are not the ones who prove their worth to the world. They are the ones who quietly remember it, even when the world forgets.